For this learning session, you will be needing the following materials. Watercolor. You may use pans like this or watercolor tubes if you prefer to use those kinds of watercolor. You may also need brushes. Any paintbrush will do. Watercolor paper or cardboards if you don't have any watercolor paper. And last but not the least, 2 jars of water. Let's start the activity by prepping up your watercolor paper. Okay? You may use the watercolor paper as is, or you may prep your watercolor paper for this activity with 16 boxes using a masking tape or a paper tape. Any of these setup will do. In order for us to learn the watercolor techniques, the basic watercolor techniques, we must need to understand that watercolor won't work without water. That's why we will be needing 2 jars of water instead of one. Why is that? That is to ensure na meron tayong clean water where we can get our water for our watercolor, and dirty water or wash water, as I call it, where you can dip your brushes and clean your brushes as well. Let's start with the first technique that we will be tackling with watercolor. Let's start with what we call wet on wet technique. Basically, it just means that your paper should be wet, and also your pigments or your watercolor should be wet as well. What do we mean by that? Okay, wet on wet technique is usually achieved by wetting your paper. Let's clean our brush first. Let's pick a clean brush para maiwasan natin ang pigment. Then let's scrub out that color. Okay, let's wet our paper first. Okay, let's have a wet paper. Then we will get our pigment. Okay, so we should have more water and less pigment in the ratio. So let's add more water. I'm loading it up with water. And as you can see, the water displaces the paint and para siyang kumakalat. Diba? Okay, that's with one color. But we can also experiment with 2 colors. Let's see kung anong effect niya kapag wet ang paper, when the paper is wet, and also we have more water as compared to pigments or the color itself. Let's use green. Okay, let's load it up with water. Okay, remember that when you're using wet on wet technique, the watercolor follows the direction of the water. I'll be demonstrating it later on. Okay, then let's overlay another color. Let's take a closer look. Notice how the pigments mix on their own. That's because both the water and the pigment or the watercolor is wet. Hence the name wet on wet technique. It won't stop there. I'll look at this. When my water is has its direction, kapag may direction ng water, susundan ito ng pigment such as this. Let's take a look. I am making diagonal lines with water. Then I'll be using my red pigment right here. So with wet on wet, you can explore the movement of the water or let the water move the color for you. Let's notice how the watercolor disperses with the direction of the water. So kung saan lang yung basa, doon lang gagalaw si watercolor. I'll paint on the dry part of the paper. Notice how the paint is still and it does not mix with the wet part of the paper. So that's your wet on wet technique. Wet paper and wet color. Now, where can we apply this technique? Okay, most of the times, wet on wet technique is applied in skies, oceans, things that are free. Okay, madalas, when the subject is spontaneous, painters often use wet on wet technique. So let's try to wet the paper. Let's try to wet it out. Okay, not that wet, pero yung katamtaman lang para gumalaw ang paint doon sa mismong paper. Okay? So, it's now, medyo basa na siya, right? Okay, I will get my blue color. And I will add water dito sa palette. As you can see, I'm lifting up the color. And I'm adding water as I go. Okay? Okay. So, notice how the water disperse. Okay? Kung paano kumakalat yung paint. I'll be using another brush. A round brush. Like this. Let's zoom it ng kaunti and let's see paano gumagalaw yung water doon sa wet paper. Okay, that's why I highly advise that if you will paint using watercolor, make sure that your paper is thick enough to hold water, yung hindi agad siya masisira, okay? Now, one technique that I use is I lift the paint using a cloth or a tissue to create clouds. Okay? So, nagkakaroon ng soft spots that, well, looks like clouds. Okay. So, that's how wet on wet technique works in a painting. Pero let's try to finish this painting first, no? Um, habang siya ay basa pa. Then let's add our little sunshine right here. And let the water work. And now let's draw the ocean right here. We'll get back to this painting as we progress with our other techniques. Another technique is called wet on dry technique. Basically, it's just dry paper and wet paint. So we will be painting in a dry paper. Uh, compared dun sa nauna nating technique na nire-require tayo magkaroon ng wet paper for it to work. Now, this technique is mainly dipping your brush onto your wet pigment. So, yung ratio ng water and pigment or watercolor dito ay medyo pantay na 50-50. Dito medyo 70-30 tayo, clinging more with the water. So with wet on dry technique, we can have flat washes or flat colors that don't behave like what happens here. Dahil kung mapapansin ninyo, kapag wet on wet technique, pwedeng magtulo yung water. For example, hihipan ko siya. See? Pwedeng kumalat yung water. We can use that artistically, but artists oftentimes avoid it para hindi messy yung artwork. Okay. But with wet on dry technique, you can create flat washes. Or, well, the colors are now balanced, di ba? Nakikita nyo yung buong color ng walang gradient or hindi nag-iiba yung kanyang value. Now, wet on dry technique is mainly used in illustrations or other designs dahil po hindi po nagmi-mix yung dalawang kulay kapag you overlay it like this. But make sure that the paint is dry ha, the layer is dry. It won't mix that much as compared dito sa wet on wet na kapag ginanyan natin, kusa siyang nagmi-mix on its own. So with wet on dry, you can paint over it as long as it's dry or paint on its side but still your pigments won't mix. Hindi gaya dito sa ating wet on wet technique na yung color ay nagmi-mix on its own dahil sa tubig. Okay. Let's try it with two different colors. Okay. And let's create something. See how flat the color is when your paint is wet and your paper is dry. Okay. Diba? We'll let that dry and I'll get another color here. And we'll let it dry first. Now that it's dry, pag hinawakan nyo siya, tuyo na siya, let's get another pigment and let's overlay another color doon sa wet on dry natin. Using the same technique ha, wet on dry technique pa rin. Let's get more. Let's get red, I think. Notice how the shape remains stable. Hindi siya kumakalat. Okay? At mas mabilis siya matuyo as compared dito sa ating wet on wet, which is now, hanggang ngayon, ay basa pa. Well, we can also do wet on dry above wet on wet as long as the paint is already dry. Kasi pag hindi po siya dry, ganito ang mangyayari. Okay? Kakalat siya. And if we will let the water work, kakalat siya. Let's see kung ano mangyayari kapag hinintay natin siyang matuyo. Let's try naman mag-wet on dry dito sa white pigment na to. See? Hindi ko makalat yung ating pigment. Yeah, that is wet on dry technique. Let's try to apply that in our painting. Okay? Now that our background is somehow dry, we've used wet on wet technique with our background, kaya medyo spontaneous looking or medyo parang kalat or medyo tunaw yung itsura niya because we've used wet on wet and we've allowed the water to disperse the paint. Let's try to use wet on dry technique naman in developing the details of this. Okay, so let's try to develop the sun's figure over the ocean using orange. Notice na hindi po nagdi-disperse yung water color natin sa paper dahil we're using wet on dry na. Okay? At hindi na masyadong basa yung canvas. Let's try adding blue to define the sky and the ocean. Okay. Now, what's good with watercolor is that kahit magkamali ka, it looks beautiful because we let the water work its way and to create happy accidents kung tawagin nga sa art to make our artworks beautiful. Okay. Now, um, I'll be adding something. Let's add a silhouette of the clouds, of the mountains rather, with violet and a mixture of yellow. So it creates us a brown-like tone. So I would like it to be a little bit more opaque. So if we want the figure to be a bit more opaque, we add more paint, okay? Add more paint. Let's let it dry first. Now for the final technique that we can use using watercolor, we call it dry on dry technique. Basically, it's dry pigment and dry paper. So, tutuyuin natin talaga yung gagamitin natin na pigment. So, we need to have a very dry brush and rub it against a moist watercolor pigment. So, let's paint it circularly. Okay, now let's choose another. Make sure that your brush is dry. Let's get a moist color. Make sure na kung feeling nyo ay basa pa yung paint, you clean it up with a brush. So, medyo dry siya. Now, with dry on dry, we can get textures, okay? We can get textures. As you can see, di ba? May visual texture tayong na-achieve. Let's try to zoom it out. Zoom it in, rather. Doon sa ating technique. Notice na may texture tayong nakukuha. Okay? Na parang medyo dry looking kung titingnan. We can achieve this by having a dry pigment and a dry paper as well. Okay. Let's try it with a different color. Well, let's use yellow. Let's use a different stroke. So, I'm using a downward stroke now. Notice na iba naman yung kanyang nabibigay na texture. Let's use red. Make sure moist lang. So, 10% water doon sa 10% water and 90% pigment tayo dito sa dry on dry. Diba? Okay. Now, let's try another color. Tingnan natin if it will work with three colors. Okay, let's start with red. I'm using it sparsely as in hulay-hulay. I'll be getting in some yellows. Let's see if it will work. Masyadong basa. We'll wash. We'll dry it out with tissue or cloth na meron kayo dyan. Now, don't be afraid to make mistakes, okay? Especially in art. Dahil that's the only time that you can learn when you make mistakes. Okay, then last, we'll use violet. Okay, so that's your three basic techniques in watercolor. We'll wait for this to dry and I'll show you, and let's compare each techniques up close. Now let's apply dry on dry technique in our painting. This is just a practice lang naman. So you can explore what to use and not to use in your painting. So I'll be using it to make textures. Okay. So I want to make, I'll dry it first. Okay. See? Nagkaroon tayo ng parang forest textures na i-refine naman natin using wet on dry technique. So I'll be using brown. Magkaroon tayo ng trunks. Then let's put a boat here. Siguro. Ayan. Let's put some birds. There you go. This is a simple application of our three techniques na mabilisan lang natin ginawa. So, I will now give you time to explore and create your own artworks. Syempre with me. Okay? So, let's see how we will apply the concepts of watercolor techniques with your artworks. Now that our practice paper is dry, let's try to analyze each technique, okay? Kung anong itsura niya after niyang matuyo. Notice na tinanggal ko na rin yung packaging tape or paper tape na nandun sa paligid ng ating mga practice boxes para mas makita niyo yung effect niya, okay? Notice how the wet on wet is much spontaneous looking and mas natural looking siya. Nag-disperse yung kulay dahil sa hinayaan natin yung movement ng water ang magdikta kung saan pupunta si paint, okay? With wet on wet technique, the ratio is somehow 80% water and 20% pigment or watercolor. So more on the water side and make sure that the paper is wet para mag-run freely si water like this, okay? With wet on dry, the ratio is much equal pa, okay? So the paper is dry, di ba? Mas disciplined looking si wet on dry. That's why it is used much on illustration, okay? And dry on dry is much expressive, okay? Meron siyang texture. The ratio between pigment and the water is baliktad naman ng wet on dry. The paper is dry and the ratio is 20% water or 10% water rather and 90% pigment. Let's compare. I want you to look at it and try to compare how it looks. As a challenge, I will be giving you 10 minutes to create your own artwork using the three techniques that we've learned today. Have fun!